So, when I say the word Victorian, what pops into your head? Probably something kind of stuffy, right? Repressed, old fashioned, all that. But what if I told you that's just a tiny piece of a much bigger, much more radical story? We're going to dig into an era of incredible paradox that didn't just come before our modern world, it literally created it. Okay, let's just jump right in. On the left, yeah, that's the stereotype we all know. But the reality, over on the right, it's an era of explosive innovation and world-changing ideas. You see, the Victorians weren't just living in the past, they were furiously inventing the future. And that came with all its messy, fascinating contradictions. And this era was long. I mean, Queen Victoria's reign went all the way from 1837 to 1901, and this was no quiet, static period. Nope, it was a complete whirlwind of change. In fact, the expansion of wealth, global power, and culture was so massive that a lot of historians call it a Second English Renaissance. Yeah, putting it right up there with the age of Shakespeare. So, what was the engine driving this incredible transformation? Well, it was a central, massive paradox. The amazing promise of progress clashing with the crushing poverty of the Industrial Revolution. And honestly, this conflict is the key to understanding pretty much everything about the era. On one hand, this was truly an age of wonders. The Victorians basically invented the modern idea of invention itself, this belief that technology could solve any problem. You had steam engines and railways that made the country feel smaller, the telegraph connecting the entire world, and new kinds of light that literally pushed back the darkness. It was an age of just boundless optimism and progress. But there's always the other side of the coin, isn't there? All that progress was built on the backs of millions of people. For the poor, the Industrial Revolution meant grueling child labor, dangerous factories, and a flood of people into these new, overcrowded cities where disease and filth were just everywhere. For them, the promise of a better world was a very, very distant dream. And fuel for this whole transformation? A population boom like nothing anyone had ever seen before. Just try to wrap your head around this. The number of people in the country doubled in just 70 years. All those people needed places to live, places to work, and that put this immense pressure on society, forcing it to change at a totally breakneck pace. So what did this industrial engine do to society itself? Well, it sparked a massive clash between the old order, the landed gentry, and a powerful new force that, let's be honest, was always going to win. Probably the single biggest social change of the whole era was the explosion of the middle class. Now, these weren't your traditional aristocrats. These were self-made factory owners, bankers, and merchants, and they used all their new industrial wealth to create a totally distinct lifestyle, building these huge houses and aiming for a new kind of respectability. But what's really fascinating here is that the middle class wasn't just one single thing. It was this complex hierarchy. You had the super wealthy factory owners at the top, then you had small shopkeepers, and then you had skilled engineers who kind of blurred the line with the working class. This mix created a really dynamic and often pretty unstable new force in politics. And you know what happens when a new group gets money, right? They want political power to match. So they fought against the old system that just favored the aristocracy, and that sparked this century-long struggle that slowly, step by step, expanded voting rights and turned Britain into a modern democracy. But the Victorians weren't just obsessed with industry. They were also great reformers. They were horrified by the social costs of all this progress. So they created what we now see as the bedrock of a modern country. They passed laws to protect kids, ensure public health, set up police forces, and by 1880, they made education mandatory for every single child. These paradoxes weren't just in the factories and the cities. They were inside people's heads. The Victorian mind was a total battleground between deeply held traditions and these radical new ideas that threatened to just overturn everything. And this gets us to maybe the biggest intellectual conflict of the era. On one side, you had this huge wave of religious revivalism, but on the other, for the first time on a massive scale, scientific discoveries, especially Darwin's theory of evolution, triggered this profound crisis of faith. It gave birth to modern doubt and agnosticism. In a world that felt like it was being torn apart by machines and smoke and social chaos, the Victorians were desperate for a safe harbor. And they found it, or at least they tried to invent it, in the ideal of the family. The home was supposed to be this sacred refuge from the harsh realities of industrial life, with the woman as its angel. This whole idea, modeled by Queen Victoria herself, became a massive cultural obsession. But of course, this created another huge contradiction, especially for women. The ideal woman was supposed to be quiet, domestic, pure. But the real emerging woman, she was out there fighting for her place in the world. They became incredibly influential writers and activists, demanding education, independence, and the right to exist outside the home. And they were getting results. I mean, this fight wasn't brand new. It built on the work of pioneers like Mary Wollstonecraft. But the Victorian era saw some absolutely crucial victories. Just think about the 1882 Act that let married women own their own property for the first time. That was a huge step toward both financial and personal independence. So here's the big takeaway, right? All of these paradoxes, progress and poverty, faith and doubt, the ideal and the real, they weren't just historical quirks. They were the very crucible where our own modern world was forged. Just think about it for a second. Democracy, feminism, socialism, workers' unions, all of these major social and political movements that define our world today grew directly out of the soil of all those Victorian struggles and upheavals. And this quote just nails it perfectly. The Victorian era is the powerful, complicated parent of our time. It gave birth to our best ideas and our most stubborn problems. And just like any child, the modern world has spent a lot of its time reacting against the very parent that created it. And that leaves us with a pretty big question. If the Victorian struggle between technology and humanity, or between faith and doubt, created our world, then what are the defining paradoxes of our time? And what kind of future are they building for the generations that are going to come after us?